9 warships are sailing straight toward a fort that looks like it should not exist. Nearly 300 British cannons are aimed at one unfinished wooden wall on a sandy island outside Charleston, South Carolina. Inside that fort are roughly 400 American defenders. They have only 31 guns. Their gunpowder is running dangerously low, and some of their commanders believe the fort is nothing more than a slaughter pen waiting to happen. The British commander expects to destroy it in minutes. Instead, by the end of the day, his flagship is shattered, his officers are dead or wounded, one of his finest warships is burning, and more than 200 British sailors and soldiers are casualties. And the man who stops them is not a famous general. He is a South Carolina planter named William Moultrie. His secret weapon is not some revolutionary piece of artillery. It is a tree. A soft, fibrous palmetto tree that the British will soon discover is almost impossible to destroy with cannon fire. But here is where the story gets really interesting. This battle happens in June of 1706. Before the Declaration of Independence is even signed, America is still an uncertain rebellion. The Continental Army is still struggling to become a real fighting force, and Britain has the most powerful navy on Earth. So why would that navy sail directly into a fort that looked unfinished, under-equipped, and almost laughably weak? Because the British made one mistake. They thought they already knew how the battle would end. And that mistake would cost them Charleston, humiliate the Royal Navy, and give the American rebellion something it desperately needed, proof that Britain could be beaten. This is the story of the battle that began with a wooden fort. Asked anyone in Charleston about William Moultrie 20 years earlier, they probably would not have described a future war hero. They would have described a planter. Moultrie was born in Charleston in 1730, the son of John Moultrie, a Scottish immigrant and prominent physician. He grew up in a world of wealth, land, politics, and the complicated colonial society of South Carolina. By the time he was 19, Moultrie had married Damaris Elizabeth de St. Julien, whose family owned an enormous plantation. The marriage transformed his position almost overnight. He became wealthy, connected, and landed. Under English law, he took control of his wife's family property, and before long, he had added thousands of acres of land to his own holdings. For a man like Moultrie, there was an easy life available. He could have stayed on his plantation, managed his rice fields, attended political gatherings, and lived comfortably among South Carolina's colonial elite. But Moultrie was not satisfied with simply being wealthy. In 1752, he entered politics after being elected to South Carolina's Commons House of Assembly. Then, in 1758, everything changed. The Cherokee War erupted after years of growing tension between colonial settlers and the Cherokee Nation. Moultrie volunteered. He became a captain in the South Carolina militia and marched into Cherokee territory. This was not the kind of warfare taught in European military academies. There were no neat battle lines stretching across open fields. There were forests, swamps, rough terrain, confusion, ambushes, and men trying to survive with whatever resources they had. And Moultrie learned something there that would become incredibly valuable 17 years later. He learned how to command men when plans fell apart. He learned how to improvise. He learned how to use difficult terrain to his advantage. And perhaps most importantly, he learned how to remain calm when everything around him was going wrong. Those are lessons you do not learn in a drawing room. You learn them when you are in the woods and people are shooting at you. By 1774, Moultrie had spent years balancing politics with military service, and he had risen to the rank of colonel. So when tensions between Britain and the American colonies finally exploded into open rebellion, in 1775, South Carolina already had a man with real battlefield experience. Moultrie was appointed colonel of the 2nd South Carolina Regiment, and almost immediately he did something that seemed insignificant compared with the war that was coming. He designed a flag for his regiment. It was simple, dark blue, matching the color of his soldiers' uniforms, with a white crescent in the corner. At the time, it was simply the banner carried by a South Carolina regiment. Moultrie could never have known how important that little flag would become, because within a few months he would be defending it against one of the most powerful military forces on Earth. and the place where that fight would happen was already under construction. It was a strange-looking fort on a sandy island at the entrance to Charleston Harbor. The British would look at it and see an unfinished mistake. Moultrie would look at it and see an opportunity. But first, Britain had to decide where to strike, and after being pushed out of Boston, British commanders believed they had found the perfect answer: the South. They believed the southern colonies were filled with loyal Americans waiting for the King's army to arrive. All Britain had to do was show up, rally those loyalists, capture a major port, and the rebellion would begin collapsing from the inside. It sounded simple. But the British were about to discover that the South was not nearly as loyal as they had been promised, and their next target would be Charleston. After the British were forced out of Boston in March 1776, their commanders needed a new strategy. The rebellion had not collapsed. George Washington's forces were still in the field, and Britain needed a victory big enough to break American resistance before the rebellion could become something much harder to destroy. Then came an idea that seemed almost perfect: the South. British officials had been sending reports to London claiming that thousands of loyal colonists were waiting for the King's army to arrive. The plan was straightforward: send a powerful British force south, join up with loyalists, capture a major port, destroy the rebellion from the bottom up, then move north and finish the job. General William Howe, Britain's commander-in-chief in North America, approved the strategy. Major General Henry Clinton was sent south with troops from Boston. Another force was coming from Ireland under Lord Cornwallis, while Commodore Peter Parker commanded the naval squadron assigned to support the operation. On paper, Britain had everything it needed: experienced officers, thousands of soldiers, a powerful fleet, and supposedly an entire population of loyalists ready to rise. But the first warning sign appeared before the British even reached their target. Cornwallis's fleet was battered by storms in the North Atlantic. Instead of arriving quickly, his ships were delayed until late May, and while the British were waiting, the loyalist uprising they had been counting on was already being crushed. At the Battle of Moores Creek Bridge in February, Patriot militia defeated a force of loyalist Highlanders. The uprising in the Carolinas had failed. That left Clinton and Parker sitting off the coast with a huge combined force and no obvious target, and that is when they turned their attention to Charleston. Charleston was not just another colonial town. It was one of the largest and wealthiest ports in North America. Rice and indigo flowed through its harbor. Ships connected the city to Europe and the Caribbean. Trade made Charleston one of the economic centers of the southern colonies. If Britain captured it, the consequences could be enormous. They would gain control of one of the most important southern harbors. They could disrupt patriot trade. They could give loyalists a powerful base of operations. And perhaps most importantly, they could send a message to every colonist who was still wondering whether resistance to Britain was actually possible. The message would be simple: Britain is coming, and Britain cannot be stopped. British scouts began examining Charleston's defenses. What they found made the operation look even easier. At the entrance to Charleston Harbor sat Sullivan's Island, a long, sandy strip of land surrounded by shallow coastal waters, and on that island was a fort. Or at least something that was supposed to become a fort. Construction was still incomplete. The walls were made from palmetto logs. The rear defenses were unfinished. The entire position looked vulnerable. To British eyes, it was almost an invitation. Destroy the fort, enter the harbor, take Charleston, move on. Commodore Peter Parker was confident his warships could smash the fort apart within hours. He had nearly 300 heavy cannons. The Americans had only a fraction of that firepower. The British fleet included powerful ships like HMS Bristol and HMS Experiment, each carrying 50 guns. Against that kind of force, the unfinished fort appeared hopeless. But the British scouts had made one dangerous assumption. They judged the fort by how it looked. They saw unfinished walls and weak materials. They did not understand what those materials would do when nearly 300 cannons opened fire. And they certainly did not understand the man commanding the defense. William Moultrie had arrived on Sullivan's Island months earlier with the 2nd South Carolina Regiment. His orders were to build a fort capable of holding about 1,000 men. Instead, he found a wilderness of swamps, live oaks, myrtle, and palmetto trees. His soldiers and laborers began cutting through the vegetation and building whatever defenses they could. The result was unlike anything the British military expected to face. 2 walls of palmetto logs stood roughly 20 feet high. Between them was a 16-foot gap packed tightly with sand. It was not elegant, it was not finished, and it certainly did not look like a European fortress. But Moultrie believed it could withstand the attack. Not everyone agreed. In early June, General Charles Lee arrived in Charleston. Lee was one of the Continental Army's most experienced officers. He had served in the British military and understood European warfare far better than Moultrie did. When Lee inspected the fort, he was horrified. To him, the position was a slaughter pen. The rear was still open. If British troops managed to get around the island, they could attack the defenders from behind. Lee wanted Moultrie to abandon Sullivan's Island and retreat to the mainland. Moultrie refused. He believed the palmetto walls would hold, and now the defense of Charleston came down to a remarkable disagreement. One of America's most experienced generals said the fort was doomed. A South Carolina colonel insisted it could survive. The decision eventually reached John Rutledge, president of South Carolina's General Assembly. Rutledge sided with Moultrie. The fort would stay. Lee was furious, but the order was final. He even ordered an escape bridge made from empty barrels across the water between the island and the mainland, just in case everything went wrong. Then he gave Moultrie a blunt warning. When the British ships came alongside the fort, Lee believed they would knock it down in half an hour. Moultrie did not leave. He stayed. And while the British fleet prepared its attack, another part of their plan was quietly falling apart, because Britain was not planning to attack Sullivan's Island from the sea alone. The fleet would bombard the fort from the front. Clinton's soldiers would attack from behind. It was supposed to be a crushing two-sided assault. But the entire plan depended on one tiny piece of information. How deep was the water at Breach Inlet? British intelligence said it was only about 18 inches deep. Their soldiers should have been able to wade across. But when the British arrived, they discovered something very different. The channel was not 18 inches deep. It was about 7 feet. And the current was strong. The British ground assault was effectively trapped before it even began. Parker still had his fleet, 9 warships, nearly 300 cannons, and a half-built fort directly in front of him. On the morning of June 28, 1776, he finally gave the order. The British guns were about to open fire, and Moultrie's 400 men were about to find out whether a wall made from trees and sand could really stop the most powerful navy in the world. On the morning of 28th of June, 1776, William Moultrie knew exactly what was coming. From inside the fort, his men could see the British fleet preparing offshore, 9 warships, nearly 300 cannons. And behind those cannons were thousands of British soldiers waiting for their chance to finish the job from the land. Moultrie's defenders had none of that. They had about 400 men, only 31 guns, and enough gunpowder for roughly 28 rounds per cannon. Once that ammunition was gone, there would be no second chance. So Moultrie made a decision that sounds almost unbelievable under the circumstances. He ordered his men not to waste a single shot. They would fire slowly, about once every 10 minutes, and they would aim only at the ships closest to the fort. No panic, no uncontrolled barrage. Every cannonball had to matter. The British, meanwhile, had a very different problem. They had overwhelming firepower, but they had no idea what that firepower was about to encounter. The fort's walls were made from palmetto logs, with sand packed tightly between them, and to a British naval officer, that looked primitive. A proper fortification was supposed to be built from stronger timber, stone, earthworks, or some combination of the three. Palmetto was soft, fibrous, spongy. It seemed like exactly the kind of material that should explode into fragments when struck by a heavy cannonball. But that assumption was about to become the British fleet's nightmare. Around 10:30 a.m. in the morning, the British opened fire. The bomb vessel Thunder began launching massive mortar shells toward the fort. Then HMS Bristol, HMS Experiment, Active, and Solbay moved into position. The British guns erupted. The sound must have been overwhelming. Hundreds of cannons firing from the ships, smoke spreading across the water, heavy shots screaming toward the fort. For the men inside Sullivan's Island, this was the moment they had been waiting for. The British had arrived, and then the first cannonballs struck the palmetto walls. Instead of shattering the logs, many of the shots simply disappeared into them. The soft, fibrous wood absorbed the impact. The sand packed between the walls absorbed even more. A cannonball that might have torn apart a conventional wooden defense was swallowed by the palmetto. The British fired again and again. Still, the walls remained standing. The bastions held. The gun platforms held. The fort was not collapsing. It was absorbing the attack. And while the British ships were pouring thousands of pounds of iron into the fort, Moultrie's gunners were following his orders with remarkable discipline. They waited. They aimed. They fired. Then they waited again. There was no frantic response. No desperate attempt to match the British cannon fire shot for shot. The Americans simply concentrated on the targets that mattered. The biggest ones, Bristol, Experiment. The 250-gun warships were about to discover what happens when an enemy with limited ammunition decides that every shot needs to hurt. American cannonballs began tearing into the British ships. The HMS Bristol was hit again and again. 70 direct hits would eventually strike her hull. American chain shot ripped through her rigging. Masts were damaged. Men were thrown from the decks. And suddenly, the British had a problem they had not expected. Their enormous firepower was not destroying the fort, but the fort's much smaller artillery was destroying them. Captain John Morris, commander of Bristol, was hit by a cannonball that tore off his right arm. He would die from his wounds a few days later. Or William Campbell, the former royal governor of South Carolina, had volunteered to serve aboard the ship. A wooden splinter tore into his side. The wound would eventually kill him. And then there was Commodore Peter Parker, the man who had been so confident that his fleet could reduce the fort in minutes, was now standing on a flagship, being ripped apart around him. A splinter tore through the seat of his pants. Another struck his knee. His clothing was shredded. His body was wounded, and officers around him were being killed or seriously injured. The American guns kept firing, slowly, methodically, almost calmly. That was the terrifying part. The British had expected the Americans to panic when the bombardment began. Instead, Moultrie's men behaved like experienced artillerymen. They waited for their targets. They aimed carefully, and they fired only when they believed they could make the shot count. The British fleet had brought overwhelming force to Charleston, but overwhelming force only works if the enemy can actually be overwhelmed, and the palmetto walls had just changed the equation. But Parker was not finished. He still had another way to break the fort. The ships could not destroy Moultrie's front wall. 3 frigates would try to get around the island and attack the unfinished rear. It was the maneuver that could finally turn the battle. Ik fusteres, worskapter, where firpte sluggesperst, first, wefjers, where fursers forks, zerls, monsters. Moultrie would suddenly be fighting from 2 directions. That was exactly what the British needed, except there was one problem. The ships had to get there first. And the waters around Charleston had one more surprise waiting for them, a submerged sandbar. The British frigates were about to sail straight toward it. The British had one last chance to turn the battle around. If the cannons could not destroy Fort Sullivan from the front, they would attack from behind. 3 British frigates, the Action, the Siren, and the Sphinx, were ordered to sail around the western end of Sullivan's Island. The objective was simple: get behind the fort, hit the unfinished rear. Force Moultrie's men to divide their attention, and once the Americans were fighting from 2 directions, Clinton's soldiers could finish the job from the land. On paper, it was exactly the kind of maneuver that should have worked, but the waters around Charleston had already defeated one part of the British plan. Now they were about to destroy another. The British pilots guided the 3 frigates toward the western end of the island, but hidden beneath the water was a submerged shoal known as the lower middle ground. The British ships did not see it. Action, Siren, and Sphinx sailed directly toward it. Then the ship slammed into the sand. The Siren and Sphinx managed to pull themselves free. The Action was not so lucky. She was stuck hard. The crew tried to free her, but the ship would not move. One of Britain's newest warships had been transformed into a stationary target, and that meant Moultrie could keep his attention focused on the ships attacking from the front. The British had tried to create a second front. Instead, they had lost one of their ships. By the next morning, the Actaeon's captain would have no choice but to burn the vessel rather than allow it to fall into American hands. But the British were not only depending on the Navy. Remember Clinton's 2-0 troops waiting on Long Island? Their job was to cross Breach Inlet and strike the fort from the rear. There was just one problem. British intelligence had told Clinton that the water was only 18 inches deep. His soldiers should have been able to walk across, but when they reached the channel, they discovered the reality. Water was about 7 feet deep, and the current was strong. The British soldiers could not simply wade across. The entire ground assault had been built around information that was wrong. Clinton was stuck on one side of the channel, Moultrie's fort was on the other. And now the British troops had to attempt a crossing under American fire. Colonel William Thompson had positioned riflemen and artillery near the inlet. When British troops attempted to cross by boat, Thompson's men opened fire. The result was devastating. The British could not establish a secure bridgehead. They could not bring enough men across. And without that infantry assault, the British fleet was still attacking the fort, almost entirely from one direction. Moultrie's greatest weakness, the unfinished rear of his fort, was never properly exploited. This was the critical mistake. The British had superior numbers, superior artillery, a powerful navy, and a supposedly coordinated attack. But the coordination was falling apart piece by piece. The naval bombardment was not destroying the fort. The frigates could not get around it, and the infantry could not cross the inlet. The British had brought overwhelming force to Charleston, but they could not get that force to strike where it mattered. And Moultrie understood exactly what was happening. His men kept firing. The British ships kept taking punishment. Then sometime during the long afternoon, Moultrie received alarming news. A report reached the fort claiming that Clinton had somehow landed troops between the fort and Thompson's position. If that report was true, everything had changed. Americans could be attacked from the rear at any moment. Moultrie could not afford to waste his remaining gunpowder. He ordered the cannons to stop firing. For roughly 90 minutes, the American guns went silent. British cannonballs continued crashing into the palmetto walls, but the fort still stood. Then Moultrie discovered the report was false. British troops had landed. The rear attack had not happened. And suddenly the Americans had their artillery back. The guns came alive again. But during that brief silence, something happened that would become one of the most famous moments of the entire battle. A British cannonball struck the fort's flagpole. The pole snapped, and Moultrie's blue crescent flag fell over the wall and landed on the beach below. For the men inside the fort, that sight could have been devastating. In the 18th century, a flag was not decoration. It represented the unit. It signaled that the position was still fighting. A fallen flag could look like surrender. And the British fleet was watching. Then one American soldier made a decision that could cost him his life. Sergeant William Jasper climbed through one of the fort's gun openings. He dropped onto the exposed beach. British guns were still firing. He ran toward the fallen flag, picked it up, and attached it to a gunner's sponge staff. Then he climbed back up the wall, and he raised the flag again. The blue crescent was still flying. The fort was still fighting. The Americans were still there, and that simple act sent a message to everyone watching from the water. You have not beaten us, not yet. As the afternoon dragged toward evening, General Charles Lee returned to the fort. Only days earlier, Lee had called the position slaughter pen. He had wanted Moultrie to abandon it. Now he looked around. The walls were still standing. The guns were still firing. The flag was still flying. And the men he had doubted were still holding their position. Lee finally had to acknowledge what Moultrie had accomplished. The fort was not a slaughter pen. It was holding. But the British fleet had one final decision to make: keep attacking a fort that refused to fall, or admit that the entire operation had failed. By nightfall, Peter Parker would have his answer, and it would be one of the most humiliating withdrawals in the history of the Royal Navy. By 9:00 a.m. that night, Commodore Peter Parker had finally had enough. The battle had been raging for nearly 12 hours, but the fort was still standing, and Parker's fleet was falling apart. The HMS Bristol had been hit roughly 70 times in the hull alone. Its rigging was shredded. Its masts were badly damaged. Men were dead across the decks, and many of the officers who had begun the morning standing beside Parker were now dead or wounded. The experiment had suffered heavily too, and the Actaeon was stuck on the sandbar, waiting for the fire that would soon destroy her. More than 200 British men had been killed or wounded. The Americans had suffered only a fraction of that number. Moultrie's men had fired around 960 shots. The British had fired thousands. Yet somehow the side with fewer guns, fewer men, and less ammunition had inflicted the greater damage. And that was not even the most humiliating part. The British had come expecting the fort to collapse. Instead, their cannonballs had spent the entire day disappearing into palmetto logs and sand. They had thrown everything they had at the position. The fort had absorbed it. Parker finally gave the order to withdraw. The British ships began pulling away from Sullivan's Island. By around 11:30 a.m. that night, the battered fleet had reached its anchorage at 5-fathom hole outside Charleston harbor. The battle was over, and the Royal Navy had lost. But look at what had actually happened. Britain had brought 9 warships carrying nearly 300 heavy guns. The Americans had only 31 guns. Britain had fired roughly 70 cannonballs. The British had burned through more than 12 tons of gunpowder. And after all of that, Fort Sullivan was still standing. The British had lost more than 200 men killed or wounded, and an entire warship. The Americans had lost 17 men killed and roughly 20 to 26 wounded. The numbers were extraordinary. But the psychological impact was even bigger, because this was not just another battlefield victory. This was June 28, 1876. The Declaration of Independence had not even been signed yet. The American rebellion was still fragile. Many colonists were still wondering whether they were witnessing the birth of a nation or the beginning of a disastrous war they could never win. Then the news came from Charleston. A colonial militia force had just stood against the Royal Navy. Not a small patrol, not an isolated British unit. The Royal Navy, the most feared naval force in the world, and the Americans had made it retreat. The fort that stopped them was not made of stone. It was not made of brick. It was not some massive European fortress surrounded by layers of defensive walls. It was made largely from palmetto logs and sand. The victory sent a powerful message throughout the colonies. Britain could be challenged. British soldiers could be beaten. British warships could be damaged. And the American rebellion might actually survive. That mattered enormously. Because independence requires more than a declaration. It requires people to believe independence is possible. Sullivan's Island gave the Americans something they desperately needed: confidence. And Britain now had a very different problem. Its southern strategy had failed before it had even really begun. The Loyalist uprising never materialized. The fleet had failed to take Charleston. The ground assault had collapsed, and the Royal Navy had suffered a humiliating defeat against a fort British commanders had expected to destroy almost immediately. The British would eventually leave the area. Clinton's troops remained on Long Island for several more weeks, but Charleston was clearly out of reach. So the British loaded their forces and sailed north. They would join General Howe for the campaign against New York, and Charleston would remain in American hands for now. But the British were not going to forget what happened there 4 years later to the comeback, and this time they would make sure they did not repeat the same mistake. They would not try to smash Fort Moultrie from the sea. They would not depend on a shallow water assault through an inlet. They would attack Charleston from the land. And in 1780, that strategy would succeed. Charleston would fall. Moultrie himself would be captured, but the victory of June 1776 would never be erased. Because on that day, Britain had learned a lesson it should have understood from the beginning. Superior firepower means nothing if you cannot use it effectively. And sometimes the most dangerous weapon on a battlefield is not the biggest cannon. It is a commander who understands exactly where your assumptions are wrong. But the story of Sullivan's Island did not end when the British fleet disappeared into the darkness. For Will Moultrie, the battle would become the defining moment of his military career. For Britain, it became an embarrassing reminder that the American rebellion was not going to be crushed as easily as many had expected. And for the colonies, it became something even more important. Symbol. Moultrie's victory was celebrated across South Carolina. The fort was renamed Fort Moultrie in his honor. The Continental Congress formally recognized his achievement. and by September 1776, Moultrie had been promoted to brigadier general in the Continental Army. Even Charles Lee, the general who had once wanted him to abandon the fort, now recognized what Moultrie had accomplished. But there was another reason the victory mattered. The British had been forced to confront a new kind of American resistance. These were not professional European soldiers defending a massive fortress. They were colonial troops, militia, farmers, men who had been thrown into a war that most of them had never expected to fight. Yet behind those palmetto walls, they demonstrated discipline, patience, and extraordinary accuracy. Moultrie had understood something that the British had overlooked. He did not need to match the Royal Navy gun for gun. He only needed to make his limited ammunition count. That decision transformed a hopeless artillery disadvantage into a tactical advantage. The British had thousands of rounds. Moultrie had only a few dozen rounds per gun. So he made every shot deliberate, and the result was devastating. The British fleet had spent the day throwing ammunition at a target that could absorb it. The Americans spent the day choosing targets that could not. That difference between quantity and effectiveness is one of the most important lessons of the battle. But Moultrie's greatest challenge was not over. In 1780, Britain returned to Charleston. This time, the British commanders had learned. They did not make the same mistake. They did not sail directly toward Fort Moultrie and expect naval artillery to destroy it. Instead, they approached Charleston from the land. The city was surrounded. The American defenders were trapped, and eventually, the entire garrison was forced to surrender. Moultrie was among the prisoners. The man who had once stood behind the palmetto walls was now a captive of the British, but even captivity could not convince him to abandon the American cause. While imprisoned, Moultrie became the senior Continental officer among the prisoners held in Charleston. He spent much of his time advocating for the other captives and pushing back against harsh British treatment. At one point, Lord Charles Montagu attempted to persuade him to switch sides. The offer was tempting: freedom, the restoration of his confiscated property, a return to his former life. Moultrie refused. He had already chosen his side, and he was not going to change it simply because the war had become dangerous. Eventually, in 1782, Moultrie was exchanged for British prisoners. He returned to the American side and was promoted to Major General. The war was nearing its end, and the planter who had once been expected to manage his rice fields was now one of the highest-ranking officers in the American military. After independence was secured, Moultrie returned to politics. He served as governor of South Carolina. Later, in 1802, he published his Memoirs of the Revolution. The book became one of the important first-hand accounts of the war in the southern colonies. Moultrie died in Charleston. In 1805, at the age of 74. But the battle that made his name famous continued to live on, and perhaps the most visible reminder of that battle is not even the fort, it is the flag of South Carolina. Remember the blue flag Moultrie designed for his regiment? The crescent remained. But after the battle, South Carolina added something else: a palmetto tree. Same kind of tree that had been cut down and used to build the fort. The tree that had absorbed British cannonballs. The tree that had helped a small American garrison survive a massive naval assault. Today, that palmetto still stands on South Carolina's flag. And that is where the story becomes bigger than William Moultrie, because the battle was not simply about one fort. It was about what Americans began to believe was possible. Before June 28, 1776, Britain possessed overwhelming military power. After June 28, Americans had proof that overwhelming power could still fail. And that lesson would matter as the war became larger, bloodier, and far more difficult. The British could win battles, they could capture cities, they could occupy territory. But they could not simply assume that American resistance would collapse when confronted with superior force. That was the mistake. They believed the rebellion was weaker than it really was. And Sullivan's Island was one of the first moments when that assumption came crashing down. But there was still one final piece of the story. The fort that had once looked like a joke would survive for generations, and the strange wooden walls that humiliated the Royal Navy would eventually become part of a symbol recognized across an entire state. The fort itself would not remain frozen in the summer of 1776. War would change it. Armies would come and go, and Charleston would eventually fall. But the memory of what happened on 2028 would survive. Fort Moultrie remained an active military position for generations. It would continue serving the United States through conflicts and changing eras, eventually remaining in military use into the 20th century. Today, the site looks almost peaceful. There is no deafening cannon fire, no smoke covering Charleston Harbor, no British warships waiting offshore, just sand, water, trees, and the quiet landscape of Sullivan's Island. But standing there, it is worth remembering what the place looked like in 1776. A half-built fort, a handful of colonial soldiers, limited ammunition, and a British fleet that seemed powerful enough to destroy them without much effort. That contrast is what makes the battle so remarkable. The British did not lose because they lacked weapons. They lost because their weapons could not produce the result they expected. Their intelligence failed, their land assault failed, their naval maneuver failed, and their assumptions about the fort itself turned out to be completely wrong. They looked at palmetto wood and saw weakness. Moultrie saw a defensive advantage. They looked at an unfinished fort and saw an easy victory. Moultrie saw walls that could hold. They believed the American defenders would panic under overwhelming fire. Instead, those defenders waited patiently and fired with discipline. And that is why Sullivan's Island became more than a tactical victory. It became a psychological victory. The Americans had not merely survived. They had defeated one of the most powerful fleets on Earth. That mattered at exactly the right moment. The Declaration of Independence was still being debated and prepared. The revolution had not yet become the settled birth of a new country. It was a gamble, a dangerous one. And Americans needed evidence that they were not simply throwing their lives away. Sullivan's Island gave them that evidence. It told them something that would become increasingly important as the war continued. Britain could be beaten, not easily, not every time, but it could be beaten. And that belief would help sustain the rebellion through years of defeats, retreats, shortages, and uncertainty. There is another reason the battle still matters. Look at the South Carolina state flag. You see the crescent, and in the center, you see a palmetto tree. That tree is not there by accident. It is a reminder of the strange fortification that stood on Sullivan's Island in 1776. A tree became a military defense. A military defense became a battlefield symbol. And eventually, that symbol became part of the identity of an entire state. The irony is almost perfect. Britain brought some of the most powerful warships in the world to Charleston. Hundreds of cannons, thousands of men, tons of gunpowder, and after 12 hours of bombardment, the thing that had stopped them was a wall made from trees and sand. The British had expected to destroy the fort. Instead, the fort became the story. And William Moultrie, the planter who had once seemed far more likely to manage a rice plantation than command a battlefield, became one of the men remembered for proving that the American rebellion could survive. The British would eventually capture Charleston. They would eventually capture Moultrie. They would win battles across the South. But they could never undo June 28, 1776. Because that day had already changed the question. The question was no longer, can the Americans resist? They had answered that. The question became, how long would Britain have to fight before it realized that defeating the American colonies was going to cost far more than it had expected? And that is the real legacy of Sullivan's Island. It was not that one fort single-handedly won the American Revolution. It did not. It was that, at a critical moment, a small American force proved that British power had limits. A few hundred defenders had stood behind a wall of palmetto logs and sand. And when the smoke finally cleared, the world's most powerful navy was the one sailing away. The British had come to Charleston expecting an easy victory. They left with a shattered flagship, a burning warship, hundreds of casualties, and a lesson they would remember for the rest of the war. Sometimes the greatest mistake is not underestimating your enemy's weapons. It is underestimating their ability to refuse to lose. On 28th of June, 1776, Britain came to Charleston expecting to prove that the American rebellion could be crushed by overwhelming force. Instead, the Royal Navy was forced to retreat. 9 warships had arrived carrying nearly 300 cannons. They had thousands of pounds of gunpowder. They had experienced officers. They had the world's most powerful navy behind them. And they faced a fort that was not even finished. A fort made from palmetto logs. A fort filled with sand. A fort defended by men who had almost no naval combat experience. Yet when the smoke finally cleared, the British fleet was battered. Hundreds of men were dead or wounded, and one of its warships had been destroyed. The Americans had lost far less. But the most important casualty that day was not a ship or a soldier. It was Britain's confidence. The British had looked at Charleston and believed the rebellion would collapse if they applied enough force. They were wrong. They had looked at William Moultrie and seen a planter. They had looked at his fort and seen weakness. They had looked at palmetto wood and assumed it would splinter. And they had looked at American resistance and assumed it would break. Every one of those assumptions failed. That is why Sullivan's Island matters. The battle did not win the American Revolution by itself. It did not destroy the British Empire. And it certainly did not guarantee American independence. But it proved something at a moment when Americans desperately needed proof. Britain could be beaten. The Royal Navy could be challenged. And a group of ordinary colonial soldiers could stand their ground against an enemy that appeared overwhelmingly stronger. The blue crescent flag Moultrie designed for his regiment still survives as part of South Carolina's identity. The palmetto tree that became the fort's unlikely shield now stands at the center of the state's flag, and Fort Moultrie itself remains as a reminder of that extraordinary day, a day when Britain's most powerful warships opened fire on a fort made of trees and sand, and the trees won. So the next time you see the South Carolina flag, remember what that palmetto represents. It is not just a tree. It is a symbol of the moment Britain discovered that the American Revolution was going to be much harder to defeat than anyone in London had imagined. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of the entire story. Sometimes history does not turn because one side has more men, or more guns, or more money. Sometimes it turns because one side makes a mistake, and the other side is brave enough to hold the line. If this story surprised you, let me know which overlooked battle from the American Revolution deserves its own story. And if you want more forgotten moments that changed American history, subscribe and stay with us for the next one.